At her party, my mom laughed and said, "You're not getting a cent. You've always been a disappointment." I sipped my drink and said, "That's okay. I'm here to celebrate anyway and to let you know I'm moving abroad permanently." Her smile faded sooner than I expected. I, 34 am, stood in the corner of the banquet hall, champagne flute in hand, watching my mother hold court like the queen she'd always imagined herself to be. Her 60th birthday party was exactly what I'd expected: ostentatious, expensive, and filled with people who existed solely to validate her ego. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in silk, and a string quartet played softly in the background. Everything was perfect, curated, controlled, just like she'd always wanted her life to appear. I debated coming at all. After years of distance, therapy, and slowly rebuilding myself from the ground up, walking back into her orbit felt dangerous. But I had something to say, something I'd been planning for months, and her birthday party seemed like the perfect stage. After all, she'd always loved an audience. My relationship with her had been complicated from the start. As the younger of two children, I'd always existed in my brother's shadow. He was the golden child, athletic, charismatic, effortlessly successful in ways that made her beam with pride. I was different, quieter, more introspective. I'd chosen art school over business school, freelance design over corporate stability, and every choice I made seemed to confirm her belief that I was a failure. My father had died when I was 19, and whatever buffer he'd provided disappeared with him. My brother ascended to the role of man of the house, taking over Dad's construction business and expanding it into something massive. I watched from the sidelines as she poured all her attention, all her resources, into helping him succeed. Meanwhile, I scraped by, building my design portfolio in a cramped studio apartment, eating ramen more nights than I cared to count. Every family gathering became a referendum on my inadequacy. She'd ask about my work with a tone that suggested she was inquiring about a particularly unpleasant medical condition. My brother would talk about his latest real estate acquisition or business deal, and she'd glow. Then she'd turn to me, and the light would dim. I'd mention a new client or a project I was proud of, and she'd nod politely before changing the subject. 5 years ago, things reached a breaking point. My brother was getting married, and I was asked to help with the wedding design as my gift to the couple. I spent months working on it, pouring my creativity into every detail. The day before the wedding, my mother looked at everything I'd done and told me it looked cheap. She said she'd always known I didn't have real talent, just delusions. She brought in another designer to redo everything overnight. I left the wedding early and didn't speak to her for 3 years. The estrangement was painful but necessary. I threw myself into my work, started seeing a therapist, and slowly began to understand how much of my self-worth had been tied to her approval. I built my business without her support or acknowledgement. I landed major clients, won awards, started making real money. None of it was for her anymore. It was for me. 2 years ago, something unexpected happened. A design studio in Singapore reached out with an offer, a senior position leading their creative team for a luxury hotel chain expanding across Asia. The salary was extraordinary, the opportunity even more so. I'd visited Singapore during the interview process and fallen in love with the city. Clean, efficient, forward-thinking. A place where I could finally be anonymous, where my past didn't follow me around like a shadow. I accepted the position but delayed the start date. There was something I needed to do first. My brother had reached out occasionally during the estrangement, trying to play mediator. He'd always been decent to me, even if he didn't fully understand why I'd pulled away. 6 months ago, he called to tell me about Mom's birthday party. She'd been planning it for over a year, he said. It was going to be huge. He thought maybe this could be a chance for reconciliation. I told him I'd think about it. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already made my decision. I was going to the party, but not for reconciliation. I was going to say goodbye. The invitation arrived on expensive cardstock, embossed with gold lettering. Her name featured prominently at the top, followed by details about the celebration. There was no personal note, no acknowledgement of our years of silence. Just a formal invitation, as if I were merely another guest on her carefully curated list. I RSVP'd yes and began my preparations. The party was in full swing when I arrived. I'd deliberately come late, after the initial greetings and speeches. I wanted to observe, to let the champagne flow and the atmosphere loosen before I made my presence fully known. My brother spotted me first and came over, genuine surprise and happiness on his face. He asked where I'd been, said Mom would be glad I came, though his eyes suggested he wasn't entirely sure that was true. I made small talk with relatives I barely recognized, accepted their superficial compliments about how good I looked, how successful I must be doing. None of them knew anything real about my life, and I preferred it that way. I was watching my mother, waiting for the right moment. She was in her element, moving from group to group, accepting compliments and well wishes with practiced grace. She'd always been beautiful, even I could admit that. Age had been kind to her, or perhaps it was all the money she'd spent ensuring it would be. Her dress was designer, her jewelry substantial. Everything about her screamed wealth and status, the two things she valued most in the world. I waited until she was standing with a group that included my brother, his wife, and several of her closest friends. I approached casually, champagne glass in hand, wearing the expensive suit I'd bought specifically for this occasion. Italian, perfectly tailored, the kind of thing that announced success without saying a word. She saw me and her expression flickered, surprise, then something harder to read. She recovered quickly, announcing to the group that her youngest son had finally decided to grace them with his presence. There was laughter, but it had an edge. My brother looked uncomfortable. Someone asked what I'd been up to, and I gave a deliberately vague answer about my design work. My mother listened with that familiar expression, the one that suggested she was enduring something tedious. Then she did what I'd been waiting for. She turned to her friends and, with a laugh that was meant to sound affectionate but landed cruel, made a comment about how I'd always been the artistic one, which was really just a nice way of saying impractical. Someone tried to change the subject, but she was on a roll. She said she'd learned long ago not to expect much from that direction, nodding toward me. Said she was just grateful my brother had turned out to be so capable, so she'd have someone to depend on in her old age. The words hung in the air. My brother's wife looked mortified. My brother started to say something, but I caught his eye and shook my head slightly. This was what I'd come for. Then my mother delivered the line I'd been anticipating. She looked at me with that smile she'd perfected over the years, the one that looked warm to outsiders but felt like ice to me, and said I shouldn't worry about any inheritance. She said I wouldn't be getting a cent when she was gone, but I shouldn't take it personally. She was simply being practical. She wanted her assets to go to someone who would manage them responsibly. She said I'd always been a disappointment when it came to practical matters, and she'd accepted that long ago. The group had gone silent. Several people looked away, embarrassed. My brother started to protest, but I held up my hand. I took a slow sip of my champagne, let the moment stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable, and then I spoke. I told her that was perfectly fine with me. I said I'd actually come to celebrate with her tonight and to share some news of my own. I was moving abroad permanently. Singapore, to be specific. Senior creative director for a major luxury hotel chain. 6-figure salary in USD, full expat package, the works. I'd be leaving in 3 weeks. I watched her face carefully as I continued. I told her I'd purchased a stunning apartment overlooking Marina Bay, that I'd be traveling constantly for work. Dubai, Paris, Tokyo, New York. I mentioned, almost casually, that I'd been featured in several international design publications recently, that my work had been nominated for industry awards she'd never heard of, but that actually meant something in my field. Then I delivered the final blow. I told her I was grateful, actually, for her clarity about the inheritance. It made my decision easier. I explained that I'd been debating whether to maintain any connection with the family after the move, whether to come back for holidays or major events. But her announcement had simplified things. I could move forward completely, start fresh in every possible way, without any lingering obligations or expectations. Her smile had indeed faded faster than I'd anticipated. The smugness drained from her face, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. She started to speak, but I wasn't finished. I turned to my brother and told him I'd miss him, that I hoped we could stay in touch properly, that he was welcome to visit any time. I was sincere about that. He'd never been the problem. Then I turned back to my mother and thanked her. I told her that her consistent belief in my failure had been oddly motivating. Every time she told me I wouldn't amount to anything, I'd worked harder. Every dismissive comment had fueled me. In a way, she'd made me who I was, just not in the way she'd intended. The crowd around us had grown as people sensed drama unfolding. My mother tried to recover, attempted to laugh it off, said I was being dramatic and that we could discuss this privately later. But her voice had lost its confidence. I could see her trying to calculate, to figure out if I was bluffing, to assess how this looked to her friends. I told her there was nothing to discuss. I'd already accepted the position, already arranged everything. I was simply informing her as a courtesy, since this was as good a time as any. I said I hoped she enjoyed her party in her life, and that she should focus on the child who'd made her proud. I had my own life to live now, and it didn't include waiting around for her approval or her money. My brother followed me as I walked away, catching my arm near the exit. He looked stunned, asked if I was serious, if this was really happening. I told him it was completely real, showed him the contract on my phone, the lease agreement for the Singapore apartment. He asked why I hadn't told him sooner, and I explained that I'd needed to do this my way, on my timeline. I gave him my new contact information and told him the door was always open for him. He hugged me, and I realized it was the first time he'd done that in years. He said he was proud of me, that he'd always known I had it in me, that he was sorry for not standing up to her more. I told him it wasn't his burden to carry, that this was between her and me, and that it was finally over. I left the party and didn't look back. Update 1. The fallout began the next morning. My phone started ringing before 8 a.m., my mother, repeatedly. I didn't answer. Then came the texts, dozens of them. They started angry, accusing me of ruining her party and embarrassing her in front of her friends. Then they shifted to dismissive, saying I was being childish and that she'd been joking about the inheritance. By afternoon, they'd become almost pleading, saying we needed to talk, that I was misunderstanding everything, that family was important. I didn't respond to any of them. My brother called that afternoon, and I answered. He told me things at Mom's house were intense. She'd spent the morning calling relatives, trying to control the narrative, but people had been there. They'd heard what happened. Some were supportive of me, which apparently enraged her further. She was demanding my brother get me to come to a family meeting to work this out properly. I told my brother there was nothing to work out. I wasn't angry anymore. That was the truth. I'd processed my anger years ago in therapy. This wasn't about revenge or hurting her, though I understood it might look that way. This was about freedom, about finally cutting a cord that had been strangling me for decades. He understood, or at least he said he did. He told me she was scared, that she'd realized I was serious, that she might actually lose contact with me completely. I told him that was her choice to worry about now, not mine. Over the next 2 weeks, the calls and messages continued sporadically. She tried different approaches: anger, guilt, bargaining. She sent messages saying she'd reconsider the inheritance situation, that she'd been hasty. She claimed she'd said those things because she thought I'd given up, that she'd wanted to motivate me. The revisionist history would have been impressive if it wasn't so transparent. I remained silent. I was busy anyway, preparing for the move, selling furniture, closing accounts, saying goodbye to friends who actually mattered. The design studio in Singapore was handling most of the logistics, which made everything surprisingly smooth. 3 days before my flight, my brother asked if he could take me to dinner. I agreed, and we met at a quiet restaurant downtown. He told me Mom was struggling, that she'd apparently told several friends she was worried she'd never see me again. He wasn't asking me to change my mind, he clarified. He just wanted me to know. I told him the truth. I didn't know if she'd ever see me again. That depended entirely on whether she was capable of change, of genuine reflection. But I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I'd waited 34 years for her to see me as I actually was, rather than as a disappointment. I was done waiting. My brother asked if there was anything he could do. I told him the best thing he could do was live his own life, stop playing mediator, stop feeling responsible for managing our mother's emotions. He had his own family to think about now. This wasn't his problem to solve. We talked about other things after that: his kids, his business, my plans in Singapore. It felt good, normal, like brothers should feel with each other. He made me promise to send photos, to video call regularly, to let him visit once I was settled. I promised, and I meant it. The day before my flight, I received a letter. Not an email or text, an actual handwritten letter, delivered by courier. It was from my mother. Update 2. I almost didn't open the letter. I stood in my nearly empty apartment, looking at the envelope with my name written in her distinctive handwriting, and seriously considered throwing it away unopened. But curiosity won out, or maybe it was something else. A final grasp at hope I hadn't realized I was still carrying. The letter was 3 pages long. It started with an apology, though the kind that was littered with justifications. She was sorry for what she'd said at the party, but she'd been caught off guard. She hadn't realized I was doing so well, which was my fault for not keeping her informed. She'd always loved me, even if she'd had a hard time showing it. She admitted she'd been harder on me than on my brother, but only because she'd worried about me more. She said I was sensitive, that the world was cruel to sensitive people, that she'd been trying to toughen me up. Then came the part that actually made me pause. She wrote that after my father died, she'd been terrified. Terrified of being alone, of not being able to provide for us, of losing everything they'd built together. My brother had stepped up immediately, had been so much like my father that it had been easy to lean on him. But I'd grieved differently, pulled away, chosen a path she didn't understand. She'd interpreted that as rejection, as judgment of her and the life she valued. She wrote that watching me walk away from the party had felt like watching my father's funeral again, like losing someone she loved but never knew how to hold on to properly. She acknowledged, in careful language, that she'd said hurtful things over the years, that she'd made me feel small when she should have been proud, that she'd confused love with control and fear with protection. The letter ended with a request. She asked if I would come see her before I left, just for an hour. No pressure, no expectations. She just wanted to say goodbye properly. I sat with that letter for a long time. Part of me wanted to see this as manipulation, another attempt to reel me back in. But there was something in the tone, in the handwriting itself, less certain, more vulnerable, that suggested this might be genuine. I called my brother and asked him honestly if he thought she'd written this herself or if someone had helped her. He was quiet for a moment, then told me she'd been writing and rewriting it for 2 days, that she'd shown him several drafts asking if it sounded too defensive or not honest enough. That image, my always certain mother doubting herself enough to ask for help, did something to my resolve. I told him I'd think about it. That night, I walked through the city one last time, past the coffee shop where I'd spent countless hours building my portfolio, past the studio where I'd gotten my first real break, past all the markers of the life I'd built despite her. And I realized something important. I'd won. Not against her, exactly, but for myself. I'd become successful, happy, independent. Her opinion no longer had the power to destroy me. With that clarity, I called her. I told her I'd meet her the next morning for coffee, 1 hour, in a neutral public place. She agreed immediately, her voice careful and grateful in a way I'd never heard before. We met at a cafe near the river, early enough that it was mostly empty. She looked different, smaller somehow, older. She was wearing minimal makeup and simple clothes, not her usual armor of perfection. I sat down across from her and waited. She thanked me for coming, and I could see her hands shaking slightly around her coffee cup. She told me she'd spent the week since her party doing something she rarely did, listening. She'd talked to her therapist, someone she'd been seeing since my father's death, but had never really been honest with. She'd talked to her friends, the ones who'd been at the party, and apparently several of them had been surprisingly frank about what they'd witnessed over the years. She said she'd called my old art school, talked to one of my former professors who remembered me. She'd looked up my work online, really looked at it, spent hours going through my portfolio and reading reviews. She'd done what she should have done years ago, try to understand my world instead of dismissing it. Then she said something that cracked the shell I'd built around this conversation. She told me that what hurt most about the party wasn't the embarrassment, though that stung. It was the look on my face when I'd thanked her for motivating me through her cruelty. Because she could see, finally, that I'd meant it. That I'd needed her dismissal to fuel me because I'd given up on ever getting her approval. And that was her failure, not mine. I didn't say anything for a while. I watched the river through the window, watched people starting their days, moving forward like I was about to do. Finally, I told her I appreciated her honesty and that I believed she was trying. But I also told her that none of this changed my plans. I was still leaving. I was still moving forward with my life. Whether she was part of that life in the future would depend on whether this transformation was real or temporary. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and said she understood. She asked if she could write to me, if we could talk occasionally. She wasn't asking to be my mother again, not in the way she'd been. She was asking for the chance to know me, actually know me, if I'd be willing. I thought about all the years of hurt, all the ways she'd made me feel worthless. But I also thought about what my therapist had told me, that healing doesn't require forgiveness, but it does require letting go of the hope that the past could have been different. And suddenly, I realized I had let go. The past was what it was. The question was what came next. I told her we could try. No promises, no expectations. I'd email her once I was settled. We could talk occasionally, and we'd see what developed. But I was clear. The first time she criticized my choices or made me feel small, I was done. I wasn't interested in a relationship where I had to defend my existence. She agreed to the terms without hesitation. We talked for another half hour, carefully, about practical things. She asked about Singapore, about my apartment, about the work I'd be doing. She listened without judgment, asked questions that showed genuine interest. It was strange, unfamiliar, but not entirely unpleasant. When we stood to leave, she asked if she could hug me. I hesitated, then agreed. It was brief and awkward, but it was something. As I walked away, she called my name. I turned back, and she told me she was proud of me. That she should have said it years ago, but she was saying it now. That what I'd accomplished was remarkable, and she was sorry she'd made me do it without her support. I nodded, not quite ready to say thank you for something that should have been freely given all along. But I appreciated the gesture. Update 3. I'm writing this from my apartment in Singapore. I've been here for 2 months now, and the city is everything I'd hoped it would be. The work is challenging and fulfilling. My team is talented and respectful, and I wake up every morning looking out at a view that reminds me how far I've come. My mother and I exchange emails every week or so. They're brief, careful, but increasingly genuine. She asks about my work, my life here, shares small details about her own days. She's never once criticized or second-guessed my decisions. It's early yet, and I'm not naive enough to think we've fixed decades of damage in a few months. But it's a start. My brother visited last month with his family, and we had an incredible time. His kids love the city, and watching them explore with wide eyes reminded me why I'd been right to take this leap. He told me Mom asks about me constantly, shows his kids pictures of my work with pride she never showed me directly. He said she keeps articles about the hotel projects I'm working on, has started telling people her son is a designer in Singapore with genuine enthusiasm. It's strange to be proud of someone for doing the bare minimum of what a parent should do. But I suppose we're all working with the tools we have. The truth is, leaving was the best decision I ever made. Not because it punished her, though maybe it did, but because it freed me. I'm not living in reaction to her anymore, not trying to prove her wrong or earn her approval. I'm just living, building the life I want, and letting the chips fall where they may. Sometimes I think about that moment at her party, watching her smile fade as she realized I was serious. I don't feel vindictive about it anymore. It was simply necessary, the final severing of a dynamic that had poisoned both of us for too long. She needed to lose me to understand what she'd been doing. I needed to walk away to understand my own worth. The story doesn't have a neat ending because it's not really over. My relationship with my mother is a work in progress, one that might succeed or fail depending on whether she can maintain this growth. But the important thing is that my happiness no longer depends on that outcome. I built my life despite her, and now I'm living it for myself. That's not revenge, exactly. It's something better, it's freedom. If you like this story, please like this video and subscribe us for more such real-life-based stories. Thanks in advance.